Scandinavians started living in long, narrow houses around the time that they started to be able to make iron tools so that they could cut down large trees. The width of the house is limited by the size of the tree you can cut down. The length is essentially unlimited. And this actually, as you can see on this slide, started about 500 BC and continued up to and through the Viking Age, that they lived in long, narrow houses with a central hearth in the middle and an open skylight smoke hole above it. This particular reconstruction is in Denmark, in the land of Lara, land of legend. And if I forget to mention as we go along, the photographs in here are photographs that Owen and I took on various trips. The pictures are from a book in Norwegian on Norwegian architecture, the line diagrams that I'll be showing a little later. Now, to show a little more detail of how we know the floor plans in the Iron Age, you can see post holes where Iron Age houses were. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the long, narrow pattern that was frequently demonstrated. So what do we learn from the Iron Age halls? From archaeology, we know that they were long and narrow. They were sunk into the ground several feet. Some were very long, up to 50 meters. They had 2 rows of posts along length of the hall, which supported the roof beams. Central hearth, as I mentioned, with no chimney, just a hole above it. The walls were very low in these early halls, and they were not weight-bearing, so they could be made of stuff like unmortared stone or wattle and daub, and it didn't matter because they didn't have to hold up the weight of the roof. Only the posts did that. Roofs have not survived, but we presume they used whatever material they had to hand: sod, thatch, wood, or stone. Often people shared their home with animals. These are cold places, and in the winter it was much easier to take care of your animals if they were in there with you, and it also helped to keep it warm. Some larger settlements had a big communal mead hall, like what you read about in Beowulf, which is a pre-Viking story. And it would be separate from smaller buildings where people actually lived and worked and cooked and so on. Literature does go back to the Iron Age. Beowulf, as I mentioned, describes the size of the hall and the splendor of the hospitality, the food, the drink, the gifts that were shared, which established the status of the chieftain. So clearly everybody didn't have a hall 50 meters long. There are some descriptions of the furnishings. In the large halls, there was a raised dais with individual seats for the lord and lady, which was centered on one side of the hearth. So this is in the middle of the hall, and it's raised above everybody else. Opposite them were special seats for honored guests, and along both sides were benches for the rest of the warriors. The literature, of course, describes the ceremonial life of the nobility and not the everyday house. Now, if we move on into the beginning of the Viking Age, not very much has changed. This is a diagram from the book I mentioned on Norwegian architecture, and down at the bottom of the diagram, it shows the actual ruins. So they see the ruins of multiple hearths. You notice the hearths are on one end, the other end doesn't have them because the other end is where the animals were. It had stalls. The roof and wall structure is all conjectural because none of that survived. And there's no evidence at all for a chimney. In fact, in this particular one, they haven't even made a smoke hole. They seem to have put smoke holes at both ends and not one above the fireplace. Now we get into the Viking Age. On the left is Borg in Lofoten. This is a reconstruction of one whose ruins are actually lying right next to this reconstruction. And the other side is Trollborg in Denmark. That's a little bit different from Borg. They look very similar, but the difference is that this Trollborg was a barracks, not a great chieftain's mead hall. So the history of Borg in Lofoten is fascinating. The area was occupied from 100 AD to 1100 AD. And the main building from the early period, just before what we consider the Viking Age, was very large for that time period. It was actually 64 meters long and had 16 pairs of posts. Its size indicated great wealth and power in this very far northern place. Presumably, an extended family, retainers, and thralls would all have stayed in this building. It's partitioned into several sections with central hearths, so that implies there's several living areas. Perhaps they might separate the men and the women, for example. There are limited artifacts from this one because they tore it down to build a bigger, better one. We do know, however, in the original one, at one end, there was a byre with stalls. Now, the bigger, better one, which was standing from the 7th to the 10th century AD, is one of the largest Viking halls that's ever been seen. It was 80 meters long with 19 pairs of posts, and it was, again, partitioned into sections. But here it had a living room, an entrance, a great hall for feasting, storage areas, and a byre. Most of the artifacts that were found were in the hall area, which indicates that that wasn't just for ceremony. There are ceremonial artifacts there, but there also are daily living artifacts. And there are hearths only in the living area and the hall, not in the storage area or the byre, which is what you'd expect. You see in this picture the structure with the benches along the sides. They're only slightly raised. Because they're only slightly raised in this reconstruction, they're actually putting in portable furniture like beds and tables, which can work in a large Viking hall, but in a smaller one, people would just sit and sleep and do everything on the benches. Now, because this one is so large and so tall, the cauldrons can't be hung from the roof the way they would be in a smaller hall, so they're hung from this A-frame structure. Now, Trollborg, this is what Trollborg looks like today. And you can see the outline, that there's a big circle. This was a circular defense wall. And within the circle, there were 16 longhouses. There are 1, 2, 3, 4. Oops, I managed to move on. 1, 2, 3, 4. So there are 4 groups of 4, and these were presumably barracks. This was a definite military installation built by Harold Bluetooth in about 980 AD. Actually, he built several of these. And you have the measurements here. These were still quite large, 29 meters long, but not nearly as big as Borg. And they believe that in this group of 16 of these longhouses, that as many as 600 to 800 men may have lived. The outer ward contains other buildings that they needed, stables, workshops, and so on. Now, that was a glimpse of the rich and powerful chieftains' living style at Borg and Lofoten and the military style in Trelleborg. But a more ordinary house is harder actually to reconstruct because the ruins aren't as distinctive and it's not mentioned as much in sagas or other literature. But near Avaldsnes, which was the seat of Harald Fairhair, the first king of the United Norway, who became king of Norway in 870, they have reconstructed a Viking farm. And this is an example of a farmhouse which is smaller, about 25 meters long, and has wood walls and sod roofs. It has the same basic floor plan inside, but you see now that there's not much in the way of movable furniture. There are the benches where pretty much all of daily life goes on. And there are spaces for cooking, for weaving with the warp-weighted loom, for grinding the grain, the bed for sleeping, which is, that's a bed built into the wall there. And this is the cauldron hanging from, in this case, the roof beams above the fire. Now, even this house at this size would have held quite a few people. People didn't live in individual family groups the way we do today. They're living in large extended families. So the original owner, his grown-up children, their wives, other relatives who needed a place to stay, and some thralls would probably all be living there. There could be as many as 20 or 30 people. Now, we know the Vikings went many places, and in several of them, wood was in short supply, so they still used wood for the frames of their houses. In fact, the sagas tell us that wooden parts were brought by ship from Norway and Iceland and Greenland. And in one instance, they took the doorposts and threw them overboard, and where they landed on shore, that was where they built the house. Not such a bad plan, considering it might lead you to a safe harbor. But these houses, the outsides were built frequently of sod. The one on the left is a reconstruction in Greenland. So it's supposed to be like the house where Eric the Red might have landed when he settled in Greenland. And the one on the right is Erikstadr in Iceland. So that would be the house he left when he got outlawed and had to go to Greenland. They also carried this to the New World. This is Lansum Meadows. And this picture is the main hall of what we believe was Leif Erikson's camp in Vinland. The sagas say that an entire longship company, 35 people, could winter in this hall. There were actually 7 buildings, 2 of which were smithies, and one was a place for serfs, which were all in the same area. And Parks Canada has actually reconstructed all of the buildings. They all have wood frames with sod walls and roofs. Several of them are joined end to end so that in the cold winter you could go between the buildings without having to go outside. As a dose of reality, one of the reconstructions burned down, and when they rebuilt it, they only use a gas fire. You say, well, how can a sod house burn down? Well, it can burn from the inside if you lose the frame. Now, the houses evolved toward the end of the Viking Age, and this is evolution of house in Iceland. This is a reconstruction which is right at the end of the Viking Age, 11th or 12th century. And it differs from all the other ones I've shown you so far in that there are rooms that go off to the side. So it still has the long hall construction, but it's starting to have rooms off to the side. And it's got the same basic wood with sod roofs and walls. Now, Stickelstead, I'm showing as an example of the end of the Viking Age. This great hall has been reconstructed to be a late period chieftain's hall. There wasn't actually one that ever stood on this site, so it's more to honor St. Olaf than to reconstruct a hall he actually had. But it's built in a style that is believed to be 11th century, a combination of the older longhouses and the later stave churches. The building in the upper right is a 12th century replica of a monastery guest house. You notice the log construction is completely different from the adjacent longhouse, even though we're talking about only a century of time. And before this, we've been talking about 1,000 years when the basic longhouse construction stayed the same. But it suddenly changed because of the change to log building. The rooms inside are smaller, they're almost square. Here's an example from the Oslo Folk Museum with Owen there in front. And on the right, you see a transitional floor plan when you're moving from a longhouse that had a central fire to a house that eventually will have a chimney but doesn't yet. If you look right here, there's a stove, but oops, no chimney. The smoke's just coming out a hole. So to summarize, the Viking longhouses were narrow, 5 to 7 meters, but long, 15 to 75 meters, or even longer in the case of the great chieftains' halls. Wood frames on stone foundations, and the walls were whatever you had to hand. Roofs were whatever you had to hand. There are 2 rows of posts running along, supporting all the roof beams, so the wall doesn't hold up the weight. The floor is dirt or maybe stone, and you've got the basic design with a central fire, the long benches along the sides. Typically no windows, although we'll get into that a little bit later, and an extended family from a dozen to several dozen people would be living there. How do we know this? No extant buildings, but archaeology gives us the size and shape and basic construction, at least for the posts. The sagas give us brief descriptions. Extant timber frame houses in Scandinavia and Iceland give us ideas of how the joints were done. And modern reconstructions can show how we think it may have been built, what it looked like, and as we move on, also what it feels like to live in it. And now I'm going to hand this over to Owen, who can talk about the longhouse we built.